Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight for Assembly Online, tonight's event's critical reading discussion. Writers Philippa Snow and Higham-Stainton will be reading from and discussing Heroines by Kate Zambreno, a manifesto for toxic girls that reclaims the wives and mistresses of modernism for literature and feminism. If you would like to pose questions at all throughout the discussion, please write them in the chat and I'll pass them on to the speakers. They've provided me with a short audio recording, which is around 3 minutes long, that I'm going to play before they start talking. Their voices are crossing over quite a lot throughout that, but it should give you a feeling of the text if you haven't read it before. So I'm going to go straight into that now, and I'll be back at the end to tell you more about next week's event. But I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
Sometimes, soon after our epic fights, I get my period. What a humiliating denouement, somehow tempering what I feel certain is my justified rage. And the Papin sisters were on their menstrual periods, allegedly. They wear the red garbs of criminals.
Scott's life ledger, his meticulous coding of Zelda's days.
Also blamed for
Tom writing the state of Viv's bowels vividly in letters. These men were caretakers of their invalid wives. They elaborately recorded their wives' centenary.
All of Vivian's problems always blamed on her menstrual periods. Virginia, too, had difficult periods. One day a seething thing, the next a cramped girl child moaning while John brings me tea. What Simone de B calls the half-alienation of a woman. The Michael Hastings film Tom and Viv pins the Elliots' train wreck of a marriage almost entirely on Viv's hormones and her drug use.
The horizon of her illness was slowly widening. My invalid, dependent
in 1915, T.S. Eliot and Vivian Haywood elope, but her long-standing gynecological and emotional problems disrupt their planned honeymoon.
He exaggerated Vivian's symptoms,
that second failed honeymoon at sea,
with his own,
that scene in the film,
the
red-stained white sheet in the honeymoon suite. Miranda Richardson in her flapper bob is on her knees. I disgust you. She internalises the shame like she is some aberrant criminal. Willem Dafoe as Papa Tom is absolutely mortified. He flees the scene. The film is awful caricature, but so is much of the Elliot mythography.
Insomnia, exhaustion,
From Vivian's biography,
cloudiness.
while the distraught Vivian locked herself in the bedroom and apparently damaged the room. It's confusing. Seriously, it's some blood. What is Eliot's objective correlative here? As confusing as Rochester explaining to Jane Eyre that his first wife Bertha turned out to be vulgar and sluttish, and we're supposed to believe this gives him some moral license to lock her up in the attic.
My howling headaches. Our maladies speak crassly and loudly.
The poet and artist's model Louise Colette was vulgar as well. She was known in the artistic circles of 19th century Paris as the Muse. He wrote to her, "Don't you feel everything is currently dissolving into the humid element? Tears, chatter, breastfeeding. Contemporary literature is drowning in women's menses."
The shawl over her
the mess, the fucking mess. Maybe that's it. The untidiness of it all, the threat that spills out, the excess that cannot be cleaned up, controlled, and yet Eliot channeled his excess, his horror of it. In his poem Ode, written 3 years after his marriage, maybe circling around that traumatic scene, when the bridegroom smoothed his hair, there was blood upon the bed. He was horrified by her repulsive femininity, its excesses. Her brother to Michael Hastings in an interview, Viv Sanitary tales always put a man off. Embedded in this is the idea that a woman is nature, violence, instability, hysterical, originating from her womb.
The narrative told about Vivian is that she was delicate, the sickly sort.
Succubus, the first wife, like Lilith. She is a demon bent on unmanning him. Clytemnestra paving Agamemnon's murderous homecoming with crimson tapestries. He the fisher king. These figures continue in the wasteland. All the violence of
her
the
messy
act.
periods a sign of feminine disorder in the 19th century.
Eliot's ancestors who judged
in
the
order
witches
to
at
ensure
Salem.
normalcy, periods are often delayed as much as possible, using a range of remedies, including cold showers. Corset and corseting, Jane and Viv, both married men who grew icy or paralysed the more feverish and effusive their wives got. He is cold on the phone, I grow hot, He freezes up. I'm trying to conjure up an atmosphere of oppression, of being good, of being silenced.
Hi, I'm Rose Higham-Stainton, and tonight I am joined by Philippa Snow, fellow writer and dear friend of mine. We will be discussing Heroines, which is a book by Kate Zambreno, was published by Semiotext and MIT in 2012. As Henry said, this is described by Semiotext as a manifesto for toxic girls that reclaims the wives and mistresses of modernism for literature and feminism. Zambreno says in the book that she is a woman trapped inside her home, haunted by the mad wives of modernism. Through a series of slashed up biographies punctuated by autobiography, her fragmentary text attempts to do something reparative for these silenced, discarded, broken, and locked up women who were writers reduced to characters through remorseless, gendered narratives, crushed under the feet of their husbands. Zambreno reminds us that T.S. Eliot once said, "I distrust the feminine in literature." She continues, "A fear of the feminine in writing, of the hysterical, the emotional, the violent, much as we fear women's rage and tears." Eliot's theories of depersonalization form the foundation of a theoretical school called New Criticism, still the fundamental ideology governing how we read and talk about writing. One cannot portray emotions in excess in literature or in life. This is a judgment not only of a work of literature, but also of propriety. One should behave. One must discipline one's text and oneself. When these women wrote of their personal experience, it was deemed naively autobiographical, as Nancy Mitford once said of Zelda Fitzgerald, in comparison to what was crafted fiction of their male counterparts. Zambreno says, "I'm more interested in the fragment, the notes, what is ongoing or continuing, to write about what is ephemeral, the daily, and to use it to attempt to think through the crisis of the self and what is beyond the self. This is ultimately about women writing and not writing, about the fullness and loss of self." Philippa is now going to read about and talk about Zambreno's work more broadly, and then we're going to do a kind of overview of the central characters within the text, as there's quite a few of them, and then we'll be having a discussion.
Thank you, Rosie. Kate Zambreno is an American novelist and non-fiction writer born in 1977, whose work tends to address similar themes regardless of genre. A friend brought this up when I was speaking of what I saw was the failure of my last book, which was published several years ago. She writes in her most recent release, Screen Tests. She said I could just write again some version of the same book, or with the same energy and impulse behind that book. Perhaps all of our books are like that. Perhaps we keep on writing towards the same thing. Perhaps they could all have a title card that dissolves to read 3 years later. Since 2010's Oh Fallen Angel, a novel about a fucked up family with a wayward daughter, whose first chapter is called Mommy, Kate Zambreno has specialised in frightening mothers, girl neurotics, shattered female geniuses, and old-school femme fatales who are most fatal to themselves. In both fiction and non-fiction, she employs an admixture of tenderness and crackling desperate madness to create a prose style that is at times jagged and experimental, equal parts theory and emotional unravelling. Because the transmogrification of emotional, creative effort into something that feels effortless tends to be women's work, she is most often read by women and is most often compared to other female writers. Kathy Acker, Angela Carter, and Elfriede Jelinek are the three most often referred to in reviews. Her best books are characterised by their sharp deployment of very particular, very femme literary or femme cinematic references, her magic trick being to make this read as effortless and interesting, instead of like the Instagram account of a hot girl who works in publishing. In Green Girl, her divisive debut novel about a sad and self-centered shop girl, Ruth, the central character is drawn as an alembic of Jean Seberg in A Bout de Souffle and Catherine Deneuve in Roman Polanski's cool, cruel repulsion. In Heroines, the self-described manifesto for toxic girls that we'll be looking at today, the reader is encouraged to consider modernism's wives and mistresses. In Book of Mutter, her 2017 book about her mother's death, there are also passages about Marlene Dumas and Virginia Woolf. At 43, Zambreno is a Gen X writer on the cusp of being an elder millennial, making her not only the daughter of her modernist heroines, but one of the mothers of a certain kind of confessional young millennial essay writing too. Heroines, first published by Semiotext in 2012, is more discursive than some of her later writing, and is characterized by its Chris Kraussian willingness to see feminine bad behavior as a form of praxis. Her new novel, Drift, about an isolated writer-cum-cultural obsessive who records her musings on filmmakers, artists, theorists, and other writers in a notebook, is out this summer. I'm really sorry because we've really hammered home that manifesto for toxic girls quote, but it won't come back again. No. And then just to start on the bios, we've kind of explained who some of the less well-known figures, or comparatively less well-known figures are who appear in the book, because it is sort of a group biography. So just to start with a few. Zelda Fitzgerald is best known as the wife of the author F. Scott Fitzgerald, and most often depicted as an air-headed flapper, a consummate party girl, and a muse to her famous husband. She wrote one novel in 1932, Save Me the Waltz, and died in 1948 in a fire at the Highland Mental Hospital in Asheville. Vivian Eliot was the first wife of the poet T.S. Eliot. She occasionally wrote herself under the cover of a pseudonym, suffered from severe health issues directly related to her menstrual cycle, and was ostracized from the Bloomsbury set once Tom Eliot left her. She is seen as being instrumental in his writing of The Wasteland. Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven was a Dadaist and poet born in Germany who lived in New York's Greenwich Village for a number of years in the 1910s. She frequently attached found objects to her clothes, including spoons, tin cans, thermometers, and curtain rings, as a performance project highlighting the ridiculousness of female beauty standards. Certain art historians believe she may have been the original creator of Marcel Duchamp's urinal sculpture, Fountain. Jean Rhys was a 20th century author, best known for the novel Wide Sargasso Sea, a retelling of Jane Eyre written from the perspective of the madwife in the attic. Living in London in the 1910s, she bounced from boarding house to boarding house and took work modelling nude, writing her first novel, Voyage in the Dark, about this period. Much of her work deals with women's loneliness and destitution, in particular after the bloom of youth has faded. Anna Kavan, born Helen Woods, was an experimental writer whose work occasionally tipped over into the realms of science fiction, best known for her jagged and dystopian 1967 novel Ice. She was proudly reckless, addicted to heroin, and friends with a coterie of professional race car drivers. She adopted the pseudonym Anna Kavan sometime shortly before 1940, after one of several stays in an asylum, having also altered her appearance by becoming underweight and bottle blonde around the same time. Jane Bowles is best known as the wife of the author Paul Bowles. In 1943, she published the acclaimed novel Two Serious Ladies, before deciding to retire from writing once her husband became successful, suggesting that there should only be one novelist per household. She suffered a stroke at 40, heralding a gradual but steady decline of her health until her death in 1973 in Spain.
Simone Weil was a left-leaning French activist, a pacifist, a militant, a mystic, and an exile. She wrote throughout her life, but gained notoriety after her death with Gravity and Grace, a compilation of various passages selected from her notebooks and arranged topically by Gustave de Bonne, a Catholic farmer and friend of Weil's. Another of Weil's books, The Need for Roots, was written in early 1943, just before her death that year, and set out a roadmap for the future of France after World War II. Weil was diagnosed with tuberculosis in 1943, but refused special treatment because of her long-standing political idealism. She died from cardiac arrest in a sanatorium in 1943, aged 34. Elizabeth Hardwick was a critic, essayist, fiction writer, and co-founder of the New York Review of Books, credited for expanding the possibilities of the literary essay form. From July 1949 until their eventual divorce in 1972, she was married to Robert Lowell, the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet who has had numerous affairs and suffered from manic depressive breakdowns. In the period that followed their divorce, Lowell exposed their relationship to public view in poems, later published as The Dolphin, in which he quoted verbatim Miss Hardwick's sometimes enraged letters and phone calls. Juna Barnes was an American artist, illustrator, journalist, and writer who is perhaps best known for her novel Nightwood, a cult classic of lesbian fiction and an important work of modernist literature. It is now considered a masterpiece, praised by T.S. Eliot for its great achievement of a style, the beauty of phrasing, the brilliance of wit and characterization, and a quality of horror and doom very nearly related to that of Elizabethan tragedy. Colette Pignot was a French author who is best known by the pseudonym Laure, but also wrote under the name Pluralist. Pignot was profoundly affected by the deaths of her father, 3 uncles during World War I, by her failing health, and by her sexual abuse from a priest. Highly implicated in the early communist movement, her affairs with prominent intellectuals such as Georges Bataille were for her as important as effective encounters. Her work was published posthumously against the will of her brother under the name Laure. She died of tuberculosis, aged 35. So
that was a lot of reading and looking down, and we're sorry. There will be more, but not for a while.
We're going to have a break and actually have a conversation. So yeah, I guess the most obviously striking thing about this text is its form.
Yeah. Well, I think the big thing about it is how much its form owes to the internet, and like very specifically the internet of the period during which it was written. So it was published 2012, and I think written over 3 years. So it would have been like end of the previous decade that she was writing. But more specifically, a lot of the subject matter, and probably some of the text itself, I would imagine, comes from the blog that she had at that time, Frances Farmer as My Sister, which was, again, that same kind of alembic of sort of stuff about her own life, stuff about her career as a writer, and then stuff about, what she calls these kind of mad wives of modernism. Unfortunately, it's not on the internet anymore, but you can find a few archived blog entries. I'm really sorry to do this again. I did want to read a fairly long quotation that I found, which was from the blog. And it's more specifically from a talk that she gave in 2013, the year after the book was published. But it kind of leads into the discussion that I think we need to have about its relationship with blogging, and also with the kind of big boom of women's personal essays that were happening at that time. So what she writes is, I remember when I was working on the first draft of Heroines, and Chris Kraus called me on the phone and said to me, "Are you sure you want to write that you were almost institutionalized? Aren't you worried about future employment opportunities?" And I remember being so confused. This is this writer who blew the boundaries away, who radicalized against privacy by theorizing it within the context of feminist art. And I realized at the time I didn't have many boundaries about what I wrote online. In terms of mental health stuff, I tend not to write about sex online. And we're in a new world with all of this, with this culture of confessionalism on the internet. I've been thinking lately about the moment when the confessional becomes a commodity, and then is that radical? I've also been thinking about the culture of the Colosseum of the internet, how I myself allow myself to be torn down so easily by hurting words or dismissals. The other day, someone I know emailed me because she was writing a piece on writers' diaries, and she asked whether the writer's private diary is lost in our culture, when so many publicists urge writers to write as much online as they can and to publicize themselves online. I was revolted by the question, even though I know it to be true.
Yeah, that's really interesting. This kind of what is precious and what has kind of potential out there in the world, and how you negotiate that as a writer and as a woman writer, and how much of yourself you give away. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much time you were spending on the internet around that time. I was spending perhaps too much time on the internet. I certainly had a Tumblr. And I feel like that's where some of the structure of the book comes from as well, almost this idea of pinning together things that you find inspirational in order to create a wider picture of who you yourself are as a person. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. But also I very specifically remember around that time, sort of 2008, 2009, women writing. There was a really famous essay is a strong word maybe, but there was a piece on Jezebel that a woman wrote about losing her tampon in her body, and then there were other sort of essays along the same kind of lines. And I really remember that moment of it suddenly becoming de rigueur for women to write about themselves in this very explicit, like often quite bodily sort of way. I mean, I don't know if that was the kind of stuff that you were reading then as well, or...
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I was thinking about it kind of a bit further on as well, and how that transitioned or kind of got monetized into something that was sort of shocking as sort of clickbait. And
yeah, for sure.
Something else entirely. So it's sort of mutated. Yeah, and I think I was sort of perhaps catching the tail end of it then, and it had become this very different thing. But you're right, I think you do really sense that the format and her, like the blogosphere, through the kind of form. I don't know if people have seen the text, but it's written in like a fragmentary style. So these are sort of tidbits, and the text jumps between the various biographies of these women, and Zambreno's own life. And what she often does, which I think kind of feeds back into this personal essay form, is she almost categorizes the areas she's interested in, right? So she talk about quite specific things like clothes, and then there'll be lots of references to clothes from these different women, and then weave it into her kind of references to clothes, and then it become like there's a sort of it's like a confessional, or it's sort of like it feels like a safe space for her to share in, because it's almost like a kind of collective sharing, which is interesting as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't like when I'm invoking things like blogs or talking about those kind of personal essays that were about quite at the time transgressive stuff. Like, I don't mean that as a criticism of the book. I think it's really interesting that it acts as like a microcosm of that time in that way, and you see it as well in a lot of the reference points that she uses that are very of the moment reference points. Then there's like Lady Gaga, and Tumblr does come up a lot, and she writes about Gossip Girl, and like it feels very much like a book that was written around like 2009, 2010, but in a way that makes it a really interesting time capsule, and also in such a way that it exists on the cusp of, as she talks about, like in that quotation, when the confessional becomes a commodity, and like can it continue to be radical if that's the case.
And do you think, kind of looking at that personal essay boom more broadly, kind of and its mutation, like where does it go now, and do we have any idea of like how she's responding to it now, as kind of throughout her, because I know that you've read quite a few of her other more recent texts.
I mean, her I haven't read everything she's written. Screen Tests, which was recent, is a similar mixture of memoir and then biography. About the focus there is more on actresses, but they have similar lives to the wives that she's writing about in this book. Obviously, as I said, her next project is a novel, but it's a novel written from the perspective of a writer who's keeping a notebook about her personal influences. So I'm not entirely sure how different that will be in terms of structure, or whether it will be very similar to this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I guess more generally, they're kind of airing your dirty laundry, whether, you know, she's reclaiming agency over doing that. But I suppose what it's highlighting is that these women, through their biographies, were obviously put in the limelight a lot, or kind of given fame or recognition via their, you know, husband's achievements, and so often their downfall or their unhappiness was out there in the world and was made public, whereas Zambreno sort of reclaimed some of that.
Yeah, and she gets to write about her own kind of darkest moments rather than it being written by her husband, who is a character in the text but isn't particularly oppressive. She does complain about him a fair bit at certain points. I mean, she did, like, there are certainly reviews of the book that talk about it as being a novel.
Sorry, we're just stopping for NHS for 1 second.
Oh,
Tapping. Some good sounds going on.
Henry's just going to tell us when the clapping stopped, I guess. I've got headphones on, so
yeah. Henry, let us know. Wow, it's quite loud here.
Oh yeah, it's here too.
Nice. Wine break.
Oh.
Okay, so we should continue. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh, now Henry says we didn't need to stop, but he thought he would mention it. What the hell was I talking about? Yes, I was going to say there are reviews that talk about it as if it's a novel. I think she's addressed the idea that it might be a novel, even though all of the details are the same as the details of her life, as far as I can tell. The character is never named, and I guess it could be sort of autofiction rather than just being like a memoir.
Yeah, that's sort of how I judged it, and I think there's kind of there's something quite interesting in group biographies. There's almost a lot of responsibility, and by inserting herself into it or framing it around her own a kind of personal journey, I suppose she perhaps removes some of that responsibility, or she feels that she does. I don't know.
I think it works both ways, actually, because when I read it, I felt that it was a very revealing book. But now that I think about it a bit more, there's a lot of quite clever obfuscation going on with the way she uses the biographical elements of these other people, because you feel as though you've read things about her that you haven't necessarily. I think maybe it's possible that she gives away less than you think she does.
Yeah, there's definitely slippage between those narratives. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and that gives some of the elements where she's writing about her feelings a certain level of plausible deniability in a way that I think is quite clever. It allows her to talk about things at a slight remove from her own life, sometimes when they're difficult things.
Yeah, and that actually kind of plays into this theme that I've been interested in, is around sort of repetition. When I was reading it, I felt like, oh, I've read this before, she's saying the same thing, and then you realise that she is allowing that slippage and for narrative to slightly blur, and so it is a sort of becomes a kind of form of resistance, like things are not clear cut. Would it be useful to read an extract?
Yeah, I guess so, just to give people an idea of the way that it cycles back and forth between the stuff about her and the stuff about other people.
Yeah.
Are you armed with your printout? Shall I go?
I am.
They were always moving. Tom and Viv, the unhappy couple. Elliot's Soho bachelor lodgings at 35 Greek Street wouldn't do, and so they began their game of musical chairs. Vivian loved to dance to the phonograph. Bertrand Russell paid for her lessons. Zelda had the same ballet teacher as Lucia Joyce. She would bring Madame Agrova white flowers in glasses. Always searching, frantic to get out of London, to a country cottage. Somewhere can you please help? They send furious SOSs to their rich friends. Then later, the tourism of sanatoriums and seaside convalescents. In their years together, Tom plunged into a suicidal depression. Each of them struggled with terrible influenza, her nerve storms and migraines. Quarrels and migraines punctuated their lives. What was he trying to escape from? His new bride, most likely. It is terrible to be alone with another person, Eliot writes, a line later excised from The Wasteland.
In London, we moved around wildly, 3 times in 9 months. All the modernist couples moved so much. Catherine Mansfield and John Middleton. Murray moved 12 times in 3 years. June and Henry Miller, nomadic in New York. Jean Rhys and whatever husband she had at the time. The Fitzgeralds, the Elliots, the Bowles, of course. A whirlwind. But how do you feel steady when your bottom is always slipping out from under you? So restless, yes, a generation lost.
Rooms after rooms, shabby flats like a Jean Rhys novel. Joseph Cornell's birdhouses, the inscription of his Penny Arcade portrait of Lauren Bacall, an insight into the lives of countless young women who never knew, or may never know, any other home than the plainest of furnished rooms in a drab hotel. A sort of marital aviary, Vivian's hawk nose, Tom's hawk eyes. They stayed at Bertie's near the British Museum, a convenient menage a trois, always French, menage a trois, maladie à deux. Elliot slept in the hall on a chair, a third to provide relief from themselves. Maybe Viv thought, why not? If I cannot be a great man, I will fuck one. Then a cramped, noisy flat near Paddington Station, 18 Crawford Mansions, Crawford Street, Marylebone.
We too lived near Paddington Station, all the wonders of W2, the first in a series of cramped rooms, the bed that folded out from the closet, the tiny school kid desk. We went to Woolworths and bought cutlery, plates, 2 white teacups, our married life in miniature. At night, a pounding on the other side of the door, the constant tempo of the humping Spaniards. Then a large room above a curry restaurant on Brick Lane in the East End, past crowds of Jack the Ripper tours, near where Zelda donned men's clothes for a nighttime tour of the docks. Our neighbourhood was known as Dodgy, the coolers luring passers-by into their curry houses, drunken American tourists, stag parties. Sometimes a drunken fight would break out in the streets, and we would watch by the windows as the bobbies arrived.
Hurry up, please, it's time. The barking refrain from the wasteland. The Elliots lived across from a pub at their first flat on Crawford Street. Tom complained about the actresses playing the phonograph. They entertained each other with cruel caricatures of their beastly neighbours. Vivian would mimic their Cockney accents. Well, you see, sir, it's the artistic temperament. We ordinary folks must learn to make allowances for artists. They're not the same as us, said their landlord, unironically.
The noise in Brick Lane was fragmenting, obscene. We had to leave.
Their move to a more spacious abode at 9 Clarence Gate Gardens, a large Victorian building close to Regent's Park. It was where they stayed unhappily the rest of their marriage, editing the Criterion, where she later lived alone, his photographs on the wall. Our room, number 3, was also close to Regent's Park, had the same dark carpeted staircases and jangling lifts of the Elliots' earlier mansions, as Viv derisively put it in a story. Another instructional tomb, a card table for a dining table, the bed actually 2 mattresses piled on top of each other.
We're going to knock the whole building down, you know. An elderly woman wanders into our apartment as we're moving in. She is Ruth Gordon in Rosemary's Baby. I'm Spooked Mia. John is at the British Library finishing his thesis.
In 1918, Viv writes in a letter that life is so feverish and yet so dreary at the same time, and one is always waiting for something. Generally waiting for some particular strain to be over. One thinks, when this is over, I will write. Vivian, always frantically looking for a place outside of London, a nice cottage perhaps, looking to escape the trauma of the Blitz, never being able to escape the trauma of life itself, of her marriage, a melodrama played out in her body.
Then the terrorist attacks of 7/7, the evacuation of our local tube station where a bomb was supposed to go off. We watched the hysteria on the TV at the nearby dormitory for international students, a framed photograph of the captain, as Elliot liked to be called, when he moved to his secret lodgings on Charing Cross Road, hangs near the snack station. The bloated, later Elliot, soon on to wife too, daughter figure, secretary. Viv also was his secretary. There she is in her Paddington flat with her Corona typewriter. She is posed in profile, hands on hips. We lay on our lumpy bed and hold each other, feeling panicked against the stoic Englishness around us, a badge of pride since the Blitz and the IRA, a sort of emotional imperialism that Viv also experienced. Only the foreigners seemed completely freaked out. So yeah, hopefully that gives a sense of the text and how it does this thing of skipping between various narratives to the point where you sort of start to forget or lose track as a disruptive device. It feels like at times.
Yeah, it seems like something that hasn't been meticulously edited. It seems like something that's just spilled out onto the page, but I imagine she edited it very carefully and spent a long time on it. It's quite a difficult balancing act, I think, putting all of those kind of jumbled elements together. And some of the writing, and we talked about this a bit ourselves, some of it just, in quite a brave way, gets very close to bad taste. Like, there's a lot of puns and wordplay, and you would think you should never put puns into your writing, but she fucking goes for it, and I have to respect it.
Yeah, she also loves capital letters.
Yeah,
she and like exclamation marks. She does go for it, and there is a brazenness to it, and a lot of that does play into the kind of blogosphere, world that she knew. Shorthand for things. She also does that. I was thinking about this idea of proximity and her proximity. What's quite interesting is that she travels. So her and her husband travel throughout the text. They're traveling or moving house for his work, and so there's this kind of this constant forward trajectory or kind of journey, and yet there's also this and so a kind of distance, but there's also this proximity in that she creates with her characters, where it sort of starts to feel very tight or close or obsessional, which I think sort of is mimicked in that slightly off the cuff attitude to editing, or using shorthand for people's names, calling Vivian Viv, as if they're friends, and they are her friends to an extent. But yeah, so there's this kind of slightly uncomfortable, obsessional proximity I sense as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's my understanding that she pitched the book as a fictionalized diary, I think, of herself as this kind of mad wife character. This idea of lineage and kind of contextualizing oneself very closely with other people pops up again and again in her work. As I said earlier, in Screen Tests, it happens with kind of actresses. There's quite a lot about Veronica Lake in there, for example. But also, she's written 2 books about the death of her mother. Book of Mutter, which I think she spent more than a decade writing, and then a follow-up called Appendix Projects, which is kind of the bits that didn't fit into Book of Mutter, or bits that she delivered as a talk around that time. And the fixation there is this, a lot of the same kind of cultural references come in, but also she's looking at herself as another version of her mother. She's looking at her mother in the same way that she looks at someone like Vivian Elliott in this, or Zelda Fitzgerald, kind of drawing parallels and imagining herself as that person sometimes.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I feel like there's lots of sort of there's references to that we've discussed a bit in this doubling, and that comes across in references to them as ghosts or as shadows, or the debuk, this idea from Jewish mythology of this kind of this shadow self. Yeah.
Well, because they are, particularly in this book, they are their husbands' shadows.
Yeah.
At least in the way that we're used to kind of, or at that time definitely were used to receiving them through literature or biography or whatever. And in this, they become hers instead. There's an interesting, weird thing going on with gender politics, in the sense that she is the author, kind of writing about them in the same way that their husbands were the ones who committed them to memory. And in her partnership, she's the author, and her husband is the one, she says, he wifes me. He's the one who kind of takes care of her most of the time. I mean, just finishing up lamely by saying, any thoughts?
Is this any thoughts to the audience, or any thoughts for us?
That was to you.
Me. Yeah, no, I do think that it's interesting as well, because for me it seems to reflect of a kind of a broader gendered narrative that Zambreno talks about a lot, or kind of references a lot of forms of, which is mythology, and the idea of who gets to mythologize, who gets to write these texts, and how are they structured around sort of ideas of patriarchy and duality, which seems kind of super relevant here. I'm interested in how the mythology is kind of within the text is ideologically constructed to control women and set these hierarchies, which kind of mimic institutionalized madness as well. So yeah, they seem quite, there's sort of different levels of mythology. There's Zambreno's clear references of sort of Greek mythology and the structures there, and then the mythologizing of these women through their husbands' voices. But essentially, this all comes from a place of like male authorship. I was going to actually read some. The book is broken into two. For people that haven't read it, it's broken into two parts, and each section is has a sort of short prelude that is perhaps slightly more poetic and abstract, and less about one specific women, but the treatment of women throughout these sort of gendered narrative constructs. So I thought I would just read one of these. She was supposed to fuck a god high up on his mountaintop, but she refused. She wouldn't listen to Apollo's reasoning, so he cursed her, a life sentence. He said, sure, you can live forever, as many grains of sand in your hand, but yet that young, lovely body will be gone. You will wrinkle up into nothingness. Who will love you now? Who will listen? Eventually, her body was kept in a jar, and then there was only her voice left, and then not really her voice at all. The rhythm of my mad women's lives, a long scream followed by absolute silence. At the beginning, I think of endings. The mad wives of modernism who died in the asylum, locked away, rendered safe, forgotten, erased, or rewritten. Vivian Eliot, whose alter ego in her writing was Sibylla, the voice in the jar that begins her husband's poem, The Wasteland. Zelda Fitzgerald, the tarnished golden girl of her husband's legend, who burned to death in an asylum fire in Asheville, North Carolina. All that remained to identify her, a single shard slipper. Jane Bowles, stroked out, later buried in an unmarked grave in Malaga, Spain, while her husband Paul never stopped writing. Sitting at the mouth of my cave, I string together fragments on paper, my scraps scattering to the wind if unread. Out of this narrative will emerge a chalk outline. It is the body of a woman. These fragments I have assured against my ruins. So this, for me, sort of really, really summons up these sort of these kind of gendered narratives that are all around us and we don't kind of even notice, or that continue to kind of play a part in our lives in small and big ways. But yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting, and how this sort of idea of women being in mythology, female gods or mortals are kind of either or women. So they're often, so if you think of like Artemis, she was like a hunter, or Hestia, who was like the woman of the hearth, or Aphrodite, who was the lover. They kind of are these very oversimplified versions of women that are either or.
Archetypes.
Archetypes. And what, I think what's nice is like Zambreno does muddy that, and it becomes very webby and overlapping at times, and that's kind of useful as a form of sort of refusal.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was thinking about that. Yeah.
I'm just kind of trying to think what the next thing is that's worth bringing up.
We talked a bit about this offline, was Zambreno's use of, or references to materiality and clothing. What do you think that's doing in the text?
I think she's reclaiming something that's seen as a frippery perhaps, in some ways. I think also she is kind of daring the reader to find her unserious because she likes those kind of things, because she's very obviously invested in glamour. She writes descriptions of her own clothes, but also the clothes that some of these wives, modernist wives, were wearing in images, or that keeps coming back. There's an unbelievable sentence, which I'm going to mention, Rosie, we discussed this before, where she talks about getting a manicure that was inspired by a Swiss sanatorium that Zelda Fitzgerald went to. So I think she's playing almost a game of chicken with the reader. I think it's like, yes, this is a very feminine thing that I'm interested in. Yes, it's not necessarily an intellectual thing. Like, what do you think of that? I think there are many moments where she seems to be doing that, where she seems to be kind of daring us to take issue with something she's doing or saying. And I think I really like that about the text, perhaps, even if sometimes I am infuriated by some of the stuff she says. I find it interesting that she's daring to say it.
Yeah, and I have this sense that it's her sudden compulsion to buy things like some OPI nail polish or a new dress to wear around the house because she doesn't have anywhere to go, or whatever. There's like a kind of a massing of things and this sort of form of excess, which is obviously a big is a kind of theme throughout the book. Is, you know, women are marginalized or questioned for being excessive, be it in kind of through emotion, and then in a way this kind of excess through materiality sort of starts to become disruptive, like feminine écriture would be, or other forms of literature that play up to that kind of emotional excess. They kind of start to mirror one another. I was thinking about that.
Yeah, it puts people off as well in a way that I find quite surprising, because that's also stuff that I'm particularly interested in. Mm. But we both read that review from the Los Angeles Review of Books, I think, where the author says that her friend had said that any woman who writes about outfits is, she says, kind of an empty suit, which surprised me. I wouldn't have thought it would be as provocative as that. No. But I guess it is. I think she is always flip-flopping on this thing of likability. I think it's interesting that Chris Kraus edited the book as well, because Chris Kraus is another author who, as I mentioned in the overview, doesn't particularly bother to make herself seem always likable. Yeah, I'm just trailing off there, so please feel free to pick up.
No, I think that's interesting as well. And we were talking about likability, weren't we? And in terms of, I suppose, sort of forms of autofiction that have, I don't know if they've usurped the person, you know, the blogosphere and the personal essay, but they're very much like de rigueur. These sort of slightly murky forms of literature, and whether, I guess what you include and what you hold back, and whether you're trying to appease people by giving them a lot of yourself and making yourself likable or sympathetic, which I don't think Zambreno does here. You know, like we're saying, there's moments of that feel frustrating or complicated, and she, you know, she doesn't shy away from her own opinion. I don't feel like she cares that much if people like her or not.
No, I mean, she says in a later book that she sees writing about herself as a means of kind of murdering the past version of herself. And because this was written over a 3-year period, she must have been writing about stuff that was in the past. I think this is why I mentioned before, and this is like, it's a bit off base, but I think it's a really interesting point that's worth bringing up, that I mentioned the quote from the director Paul Schrader, where he was talking about, obviously he started out as a film critic and then began working as a director. I think that was the chronology of it. But anyway, and he says that the difference between being a filmmaker and being a critic is that if you are the filmmaker, you are like a pregnant person who's trying to bring something to life in your body. And if you're the critic, then you are like a medical examiner. And the difficulty is not letting the medical examiner into the delivery room because he's going to want to take the baby apart. And I said to you that I think that in this book, she is kind of both. She is the critic who is dissecting things, and she is also the memoirist who is trying to bring a version of herself to fruition. And I think that maybe that's why what results sometimes feels quite frenetic and discursive and all over the place, because it is these two parts that are, I wouldn't say necessarily in her case at war with each other, but maybe two parts that have a conflicting goal existing in the same book. I can feel myself rambling. I'm sorry, please cut in.
No, that makes total sense. I think that's completely right. There is this tension. There's sort of like a tension within herself that comes onto the page, and which feels quite emblematic of what is going on even now. Yeah. Do we? I don't know if we have how much more time we have. I think we're coming to.
Yeah, we've kind of gone on a bit.
Maybe we'll leave it there. And just say that, you know, the text is available online. There's also some really interesting videos on YouTube of Zambreno reading the text. And yeah, I'd encourage you to kind of explore her work a bit more.
Yeah, I think she's a brilliant writer. Read Screen Tests as well, which is the most recent one, which I think is fantastic, and I think has really distilled what's happening here down into something that's very clean and crisp in a very satisfying way.
Great. Thank you, Philippa.
Thank you, Rosie.
Thanks, everyone. See ya.
Are we just blinking live on YouTube now? What's happening?
Okay. Don't know what we're supposed to do. Have some more wine.
I could keep going if we need to keep going. I don't know where Henry has disappeared to, but I could carry on. Blinking live on YouTube now. What's happening?
Hang on. Sorry, my audio wasn't on.
Don't know what we're supposed to do.
My audio wasn't on. Okay. My audio is back on. Okay, thank you again to Philippa and Rose for that interesting discussion. Just making sure that I am coming out. Yeah, okay. Thanks again. Next week's event on the 30th of April will be an intercontinental poetry reading hosted by Kay Draper with Ellen Renton from Edinburgh, Gobiega Odbanjo from London, Prekis Okepeshi from Masaka in Nigeria, and Georgia Tamil and Sinead Overby from New Zealand. And that'll all be on a live Zoom call, so it'll be about 7 a.m. in New Zealand. So really exciting for that. Also, tonight at 9 p.m, there's a new project launching, which is established by Anna Duffy, Hannah Norali, and Tai Shani. And it's a new online platform that will commission artists, writers, and thinkers to share their work online. It's called Transmissions. I'll post a link to it in the chat for tonight's event. If anyone would like to watch it after this. It's been set up to provide a platform to pay artists at a time when exhibitions and opportunities and like their fees have been cancelled. So the first episode will be created by the artists who are setting it up, and the next 5 episodes will be hosted by invited artists each time. It will be each Thursday at 9 o'clock, so a nice carry on from Assembly Online, but it'll also be repeated on Friday nights at 9, maybe at 9 a.m. on Twitch. I'll post a link to it. But thanks again to Rose and Philippa, and the talk will be available to watch again online if you would like. And hope to see you next week for our intercontinental poetry reading hosted by Kai Draper. I'm going to turn it off now. Thanks again. Bye.